Why won't my boyfriend come inside my house? My boyfriend Parker used to love coming over to mine, until one day he was visiting for dinner and suddenly just refused to come in. He stammered out an excuse that we should go eat at his place instead. At his apartment, he acted completely normal. But when I told him I needed to go back to mine so I could quickly grab my work clothes, he actually said he'd buy me new ones. He wasn't upset or anxious either. He just absolutely refused to go inside my house. The next day, he texted that he was outside, but when I stepped out, he'd parked 3 houses down. When I asked why he didn't pull into the driveway, he said he preferred to park on the street now. I started trying anything to get him to visit. I downloaded his favorite movie. I asked him to help me move furniture, but he just hired movers instead and refused to step inside. Once, it started raining hard while he waited outdoors, and he got completely soaked rather than step under the covered porch. I asked if something happened the last time he was there. He said no. I asked why he wouldn't come inside, and he said he just couldn't anymore. When I pressed for a reason, he said, "I'd rather not discuss it." His behavior was affecting everything. We couldn't hang out with my roommate Anna. We couldn't use my pool. He suggested I move in with him, and when I said my lease wasn't up for 8 months, he offered to pay the penalty to break it. He'd already put a deposit on a new apartment without telling me. I had to figure out what was going on. Anna said nothing unusual happened that last Tuesday he visited. Parker had waited in the living room like always. She'd been in her room most of the time. When she came back downstairs, he was sitting on the couch normally. Nothing seemed wrong until I got home and he immediately wanted to leave. She said he'd actually left his phone on the coffee table in his rush to get out, and she'd had to run after him to give it back. I checked our security cameras from that night. Parker arrived at 6:15, and Anna let him in at 6:16. There was a gap in the footage from 6:18 to 6:27. 9 minutes of black screen. He was sitting on the couch before and after looking exactly the same. But his wine glass was on the opposite side of the coffee table, and his jacket was folded differently. My neighbor mentioned seeing Parker's car parked outside for hours last week while I was at work. When I asked Parker about it, he said yes, he'd been there. The neighbor said Parker had walked around the entire house multiple times, taking photos with his phone and measuring the distance between windows. I started staying at his place every night. He'd drive me home in the mornings and wait in the car. His mother came to visit and asked to see my house. Parker told her I'd moved in with him permanently, and my house had black mold. I'd never mentioned any mold, and when I corrected him, he gave me a look that stopped me cold. 3 weeks passed and nothing changed. Our relationship was perfect otherwise, but he'd started making bigger decisions. He'd called my landlord pretending to be me and tried to break my lease. He'd had my mail forwarded to his address. He was systematically removing any reason for me to go home. I found his laptop history showing dozens of searches about my address, property records and previous owners and news articles going back to 1890. I threatened to break up with him if he didn't explain. He said he understood if I needed to do that, but he still couldn't tell me. He said, "I can't explain it in a way that would make sense to you." When I said to try anyway, he said, "You wouldn't believe me and it would make things worse for you." I asked if my house was dangerous. He said no. I asked if something bad would happen if he came inside. He said no. I asked if he was afraid. He said fear wasn't the right word. When I asked what the right word was, he thought for a long moment and said, "Incompatible." Then Parker proposed, but said we'd have to sell my house first. When I said I wasn't selling, he withdrew the ring. He said he couldn't marry someone who lived there. I said I didn't live there anymore since I was always at his place. He said that wasn't enough. The house had to be sold to someone else. When I asked why, he said, "Because then it would be their problem." I demanded to know what happened during those 9 missing minutes of footage. He said nothing happened. I said something must have happened to make him act this way. He said, "Act what way?" Like his behavior was completely normal. Then he said he'd been back to my house many times while I was at work. He'd been in the yard and on the porch and looked through all the windows. He'd spent hours studying it from every angle. He'd measured the exterior walls and compared them to the city's blueprints. There was an extra room that shouldn't exist. I asked why he kept coming back if he wouldn't go in. He said he was trying to understand something. When I asked what, he said, "Why you can still live there." He said other people had lived there too and been fine, but that didn't mean it was actually fine. Later, I found a note in his handwriting that must have fallen from his pocket. It was a list of dates and times going back months before we'd met. Next to the last date was my address, and a single word, confirmed. My hands shook as I turned the paper over and over, trying to make sense of the dates that stretched back 8 months before Parker and I had even matched on the dating app. The handwriting was definitely his, that weird way he made his 7s with the little line through them, and there were at least 20 different addresses crossed out before mine appeared at the bottom. I grabbed my phone and scrolled back through our messages to that first conversation where he'd asked me out for coffee, saying he'd noticed we both liked the same obscure band, and maybe we could catch their show together. My stomach twisted into knots as I realized he'd probably already known where I lived when he sent that message. I found him in the kitchen making dinner like nothing was wrong, humming while he stirred pasta sauce, and when I slapped the note down on the counter next to him, his whole body went rigid. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might pass out, and his hand shot out to grab the paper, but I snatched it back before he could reach it. He opened his mouth and closed it again like a fish gasping for air, then tried to grab for it again, but I stepped backwards into the living room, holding the note up high. "Why were you tracking my address before we met?" His eyes darted between my face and the paper, while his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He mumbled something about research and forums, and I told him to speak up because I deserved real answers after all his lies. That's when the whole story came spilling out in a rush. How he'd been part of online groups for 3 years studying houses that affected certain people differently, tracking reports of spaces that some could live in normally, while others felt physically unable to enter. He'd been mapping these houses across the city, visiting each one to test his own reaction, and mine was the 23rd address on his list. The worst part was when he admitted our meeting wasn't random at all, because he'd wanted to observe someone who could live in one of these spaces without any problems, like I was some kind of lab rat in his twisted experiment. My legs felt weak, and I had to sit down on his couch while he kept talking about electromagnetic sensitivity and spatial anomalies, and how only certain people could feel the wrongness in these places. I stood up and told him I needed space to process this massive betrayal, that our entire relationship was built on him studying me like I was part of his creepy investigation. He tried to follow me to the door, but I grabbed my purse and keys and pushed past him, ignoring his pleas to let him explain more. For the first time in 3 weeks, I drove myself home instead of letting him drive me, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The familiar turn into my neighborhood felt different now, knowing Parker had driven these streets months before we'd met, probably taking notes about my house and planning his approach. Anna nearly dropped her wine glass when I walked through the front door, because she hadn't seen me come home alone in so long. I dumped everything on her at once, showing her the note and explaining about the forums and the research, and how Parker had targeted me specifically because I lived here. Her face went through about 10 different expressions as she processed it all, finally landing on a mix of disgust and concern that matched exactly how I felt. She poured me a glass of wine and we sat on the couch where Parker had sat that last time, both of us looking around the room like we might spot whatever invisible thing had driven him away. Anna offered to help me figure out what was really going on with our house, suggesting we could do our own investigation without Parker's paranoid theories clouding everything. That night, I climbed into my own bed for the first time in weeks, pulling my comforter up to my chin and waiting for something to happen. I lay there listening to every creak and settling noise the house made, waiting to feel whatever Parker felt, but nothing came. Just normal house sounds, and Anna moving around in her room and cars passing on the street outside. I slept straight through until morning without any weird dreams or strange feelings, waking up to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window like it always had. I made coffee in my kitchen and sat at my dining table with my laptop, pulling up all the property record sites Parker had been visiting according to his browser history. The house had been built in 1892 and had changed hands 16 times, which seemed like a lot, and I found 3 newspaper articles from different decades mentioning strange incidents. One from 1934 talked about a family who broke their lease after only 2 months claiming unexplained disturbances. Another from 1967 mentioned a tenant who insisted someone else was living in the walls, and a brief mention from 1998 about a couple who abandoned the property mid-lease. None of the articles had any real details or proof, just vague mentions of complaints and people leaving suddenly. I picked up my phone and dialed my landlord's number, trying to sound casual as I asked about any renovations or modifications to the house over the years. His voice immediately got defensive, demanding to know why I was asking and if I was planning to break my lease like Parker had tried to do while pretending to be me. When I pressed him about the history, he practically shouted that everything was up to code and he'd keep my entire deposit if I tried to leave early. After I hung up, Anna came downstairs and we spent the entire afternoon going through every room with a tape measure, checking Parker's claim about an extra room that shouldn't exist. We measured the exterior walls from outside, then measured each interior room, and sure enough there was a gap of about 3 feet near the living room where the built-in shelves were. Anna ran her hands along the shelves while I checked behind them with a flashlight, both of us looking for any signs of a hidden door or panel. Later, I logged into our security system and started downloading all the footage we had stored, not just from the night Parker left, but going back months. The download took forever, but when I finally got to review it, I found exactly what I feared I would find. There were gaps scattered throughout the recordings, always exactly 9 minutes long from 6:18 to 6:27, happening about every 2 to 3 weeks with no clear pattern. The next morning, I grabbed my laptop and searched for the city planning office phone number, figuring official blueprints might show whatever Parker claimed shouldn't exist. The woman who answered transferred me to Ellen Rhodes in the records department, and I explained I needed the original plans for my rental property. Ellen sounded curious and helpful, mentioning that older houses often had modifications that never got properly documented, especially ones built before modern building codes. She said she'd pull everything they had on file and I could pick them up that afternoon. When I got to the city office, Ellen had a whole folder ready, spreading out yellowed papers across her desk while pointing to various markings and stamps. She ran her finger along the original 1892 blueprint, then pulled out another document from 1923 that caught her attention. It was a permit for something called a utility void, supposed to be temporary for some kind of maintenance access, but there was no record of it ever being officially closed out. The location on the permit matched exactly where Anna and I had found that 3-foot gap near the living room shelves. Ellen made copies of everything and circled the relevant sections, suggesting I might want to get a professional inspection done if I suspected unauthorized modifications. Back home, I started searching online for licensed home inspectors, finding dozens of options but settling on Maxwell Shepherd, who had great reviews and specialized in older properties. I called him that afternoon and scheduled an appointment for 2 days later, not mentioning what I was looking for specifically, just saying I wanted a complete inspection for my own peace of mind. My phone started buzzing constantly with texts from Parker, each one more frantic than the last. He kept begging me to leave the house immediately and stay somewhere else until we could talk. His messages got increasingly desperate, warning me about things he wouldn't specify, saying I didn't understand what I was dealing with. I turned my phone to silent and focused on preparing for the inspection. Maxwell arrived right on time with cases of equipment, including something he called a thermal imaging camera. He started in the living room and within minutes was pointing at the screen showing temperature variations behind the built-in shelves. The wall there read several degrees cooler than the surrounding areas, which he said usually meant empty space behind it. He pulled out a stud finder and started running it along the wall, marking spots with pencil while examining the shelves more closely. His fingers found something near the edge and he called me over to look. There were tiny gaps that suggested hinges, painted over multiple times but still visible if you knew what to look for. Maxwell grabbed a stronger flashlight and spotted what looked like magnetic catches hidden behind the trim. He stepped back and asked if I wanted him to try opening it, but warned we should probably have witnesses present first for documentation purposes. I immediately called Anna, who was upstairs, then dialed Ellen at the city office to see if she could come document this officially for the records. While we waited for them to arrive, Maxwell took detailed photos of the undisturbed panel from every angle, measuring its dimensions and noting the concealed hinges in his inspection report. Anna came down first, looking nervous but curious, and Ellen arrived about 20 minutes later with her own camera and official forms. With everyone gathered in the living room, Maxwell put on gloves and carefully worked his fingers under the panel edge. The magnetic catches released with soft clicks, and the whole section swung open smoothly on hidden hinges. Behind it was a narrow void space about 3 feet wide that ran the entire length of the wall, exactly as the 1923 permit had indicated. Maxwell shined his flashlight inside and we all leaned forward to look. There were old blankets and pillows arranged like a makeshift bed, empty water bottles lined up against one wall, and food wrappers scattered across the floor. Someone had been living in this space. Anna grabbed my arm hard enough to hurt, while Ellen started taking photos and making notes on her clipboard. Maxwell reached in with a grabber tool and pulled out one of the water bottles, showing us it was a brand sold at our local grocery store with a recent expiration date printed on it. He moved his light around more and spotted something small and electronic tucked into a corner. Using the grabber again, he retrieved what looked like a small black box with an antenna. Maxwell examined it closely, then showed us the label which read, Wi-Fi Dother, with technical specifications printed below. He explained this device could disrupt wireless signals including security cameras, which would explain our 9-minute blackouts. Someone had been using it to move around undetected, turning off our cameras at exactly 6:18, then turning them back on at 6:27. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911 while Ellen documented code violations on her forms, and Maxwell continued photographing everything. The dispatcher said officers would arrive within 10 minutes and told me not to touch anything else. Maxwell kept searching the space with his flashlight and spotted something at the far end. There was another opening, smaller than the main panel, that seemed to lead somewhere else. We went outside to check the exterior wall, and Maxwell found what we were looking for painted perfectly to match the house siding. Unless you knew exactly where to look, the access hatch was completely invisible, just another section of wall with matching paint and texture. Maxwell took more photos while I called 911 with shaking hands, telling the dispatcher about finding someone's living space hidden in our walls. She said officers would be there in 10 minutes and told us not to touch anything else or go back inside the void. Anna was gripping my arm so hard it hurt, staring at the hidden hatch like it might open any second. Ellen kept writing on her clipboard, taking notes about building codes and permit violations while muttering about liability issues. We waited on the front lawn, none of us wanting to go back inside knowing someone had been living there with us. 2 police cars pulled up 8 minutes later, and the officers immediately started taking our statements, asking when we'd discovered the space and if we'd noticed anything missing. I showed them the security footage gaps on my phone while Maxwell explained about the Wi-Fi device he'd found. The officers put on gloves and went inside to examine the void space, bagging the device and several items for fingerprinting. One officer came back out and told us this was called frogging, when people secretly live in occupied homes without the owners knowing. He said they'd been seeing more cases lately, especially in older houses with these kinds of hidden spaces that nobody knew about. They took photos of everything and dusted for prints on the water bottles and food wrappers while we stood outside watching. That's when Parker's car came speeding down the street and parked crooked against the curb 3 houses down. He practically ran toward us, his face pale and his hands shaking as he approached the police tape they'd put up. "I heard sirens and the neighbor texted me," he said, looking between me and the officers. His whole body was tense, but he'd crossed the property line for the first time in weeks, standing right there on my lawn. The officer asked who he was and I explained he was my boyfriend while Parker stared at the open front door like he was fighting himself. Then he broke down completely, tears running down his face as he admitted he'd suspected someone was living in the walls. He said he'd felt it that night when the cameras went dark, something wrong with the electromagnetic field in the house. He'd researched similar cases online for months, finding patterns in older houses where people had hidden these spaces. The officer looked skeptical, but Parker pulled out his phone and showed him screenshots of forum posts about electromagnetic sensitivity. He explained that some people could feel these devices in spaces, that the disruption made them physically uncomfortable. That's why he'd used the word incompatible, because his body literally couldn't handle being near the interference. He'd been tracking cases across the city, trying to understand why some houses felt wrong to him, while others didn't. The detective arrived and took over the investigation, listening to Parker's explanation while reviewing the evidence bags. Anna had gone to sit in her car, too freaked out to stand there anymore, already texting friends about finding somewhere else to stay. The detective's phone rang and he stepped away to take the call, then came back with a serious expression on his face. "We got a match on the prints," he said, looking at each of us. "This person is known for this type of crime in the area." He explained they'd been hitting older houses with original features that could hide void spaces like ours. The suspect had been doing this for years, moving between different houses and living in walls while families went about their normal lives. I felt sick thinking about all those nights I'd been alone in my room while someone was living just feet away behind the wall. My hands were shaking and I wanted to scream at Parker for not just telling me his suspicions instead of acting crazy for weeks. He kept trying to explain that he didn't know how to tell me without sounding insane, that nobody would have believed him about feeling electromagnetic fields. The anger was mixing with violation and fear, making it hard to think straight about what to do next. That's when my landlord's truck came screeching into the driveway and he jumped out looking panicked about the police cars. He started yelling about code violations and demanding to know what I'd done to his property, pointing at the open panel. Ellen stepped forward with her clipboard and shut him down immediately, showing him documentation that the void predated his ownership by decades. She had permits from 1923 proving the space existed long before he bought the property, and that he'd failed to properly inspect it. The landlord's face went red as he realized his liability for renting a house with an unknown occupant living in the walls. I saw my chance and told him I wanted immediate lease termination without penalty due to the safety issues. He started to argue, but Ellen pointed out the code violations and potential lawsuits if he didn't cooperate quickly. The landlord agreed within minutes, pulling out his phone to call his lawyer about the paperwork while muttering about insurance claims. I asked Ellen for the contact information for a tenant advocacy center, and she gave me Cyrus Douglas's card. I called him right there and explained the situation, including Parker's unauthorized mail forwarding and attempts to break my lease. Cyrus said he'd help me document everything and file the proper reports to protect myself from any legal issues. He also wanted to discuss the pattern of controlling behavior Parker had shown, even if his intentions were protective. Friends started showing up after Anna's texts, ready to help me pack and get out of the house immediately. Maxwell got his tools and started boarding up both access points to the void, while police increased patrols in the neighborhood. They were checking other old houses for similar modifications, warning residents about signs of frogging to watch for. Parker sat on the curb and wrote out a complete timeline of his research and actions on notebook paper. He listed every address he'd investigated before mine, every forum post he'd read, every pattern he'd noticed over the years. It became clear he'd been obsessed with this phenomenon long before we'd ever met, tracking these cases like a detective. He showed me dates going back 5 years, addresses scattered across the city where he'd felt the same wrongness. My phone buzzed with an unknown number, and when I answered, a woman named Siobhan Lancaster introduced herself as a former tenant from 5 years ago. She'd seen the news coverage about our house and wanted to confirm she'd experienced the exact same things when she lived there. Food would disappear from her kitchen and she'd find items moved around when she came home from work. She'd heard weird sounds at night and complained to the landlord multiple times, but everyone thought she was paranoid. The detective took her statement over speakerphone and added it to the growing file about our house. 2 days later, the investigation expanded when police found similar void spaces in 4 other houses on our street. The intruder had been moving between all of them using a circuit that explained why the camera gaps happened every few weeks instead of daily. He'd stay in one house for a few days, then move to the next one like some twisted rotation schedule. Anna and I spent the whole weekend looking at apartments and finally found a modern building downtown with keycard entry and cameras everywhere. We signed the lease that same day because neither of us could stand another night in that house knowing what had been happening. The apartment had no weird spaces or old modifications, and the walls were exactly where they should be according to the floor plan. We moved our stuff out while police were still processing the scene, and I felt relief leaving that place behind. Parker helped us move boxes, but I could barely look at him after everything he'd hidden from me. Once we were settled in the new place, I finally confronted him about the lies he'd told his mother about black mold. He admitted he'd panicked when she asked about my house and didn't know how to explain why he wouldn't go inside without sounding crazy. He said telling her about mold seemed easier than trying to explain his suspicions about someone living in the walls. I told him his lying and controlling behavior had damaged our relationship more than the actual danger ever could have. Cyrus helped me write up a list of requirements if Parker wanted any chance of rebuilding trust between us. Parker needed to start therapy immediately to address his obsessive research habits and his tendency to make decisions for other people. He had to stop trying to control information and learn to communicate his concerns directly instead of going behind my back. I typed everything up in a formal document and made Parker sign it to show he understood these were non-negotiable conditions. 3 days later, the police called to say they'd caught the suspect trying to access another house 2 streets over. He'd been using the same magnetic panel technique, and they caught him red-handed crawling through a hidden entrance. The man had been living this way for 6 years, moving between various houses and surviving off stolen food and water. My landlord got hit with massive fines for all the code violations Ellen had documented during the investigation. He had to hire contractors to properly seal the void space and bring everything up to current building standards. Ellen made sure all the permits were filed correctly this time, so future tenants wouldn't have to deal with this nightmare. She personally inspected the work to confirm the space was completely inaccessible and properly documented in city records. Parker started seeing a therapist twice a week and began to understand how his need to investigate everything had spiraled out of control. He gave all his research about the other houses to the police to help them identify more potential frogging locations in older neighborhoods. The detective said Parker's notes helped them find 3 more occupied void spaces and get those people to safety. I went to the post office and filed a formal complaint about Parker's unauthorized mail forwarding with all the documentation Cyrus had helped me gather. The postal inspector said Parker could avoid federal charges if he completed a diversion program and did community service. It felt like appropriate consequences without completely ruining his life, since his intentions had been protective even if his methods were wrong. Anna and I developed a routine in our new apartment where we'd check in with each other every night about feeling safe. We'd walk through the apartment together before bed, checking locks and making sure everything was secure. 3 weeks after moving out, I finally slept through an entire night without waking up to check the doors. Anna said she was sleeping better too, and we both felt like we could finally start to relax in our own space. The old house eventually got rented to a young couple who knew the whole history and didn't seem bothered by it. They installed extra security systems and told the landlord they felt perfectly safe with all the renovations that had been done. Parker kept going to therapy and slowly started to recognize patterns from his childhood that made him need to control situations. His therapist helped him understand that his parents' divorce and a break-in when he was young had created this compulsive need to investigate potential dangers. He started sharing more about his sessions and actually seemed committed to changing his behavior patterns. The Postal Service confirmed Parker was completing his diversion requirements and attending all the required meetings about respecting other people's mail. I started to feel like maybe we could work through this if he kept showing real progress with his treatment. Anna's girlfriend came over more often now that we had a safe space, and they seemed really happy together. We'd have dinner parties and actually enjoy our home without constantly looking over our shoulders or wondering what was in the walls. 2 weeks later, I sat in the waiting room while Parker met with his therapist for the 3rd time that month. The therapist had suggested I join for the last 15 minutes of each session, so we could practice talking without Parker shutting down or trying to control things. The first time was rough because Parker kept looking at the floor instead of me while explaining why he'd tried to break my lease without asking. The therapist had to remind him 3 times to actually answer my questions instead of deflecting. By the 4th session, Parker was finally able to tell me directly when something worried him, instead of going behind my back to fix it. The therapist gave us homework assignments like Parker had to text me his concerns instead of researching them online for hours, and I had to acknowledge his worries without dismissing them. We practiced having disagreements where Parker couldn't walk away or change the subject. The detective called me that same week to say they'd found similar void spaces in 6 other old houses in the area after Parker gave them his research notes. 3 of them had signs someone had been living there recently with the same kind of setup we'd found at my place. The city was already drafting new rules that would require landlords to inspect for hidden spaces during tenant changes. The detective said our case was helping protect other people from going through what we did. I spent the next weekend writing everything up for a tenant rights website that Cyrus had recommended. I typed out the whole story from Parker's weird behavior to finding someone living in our walls to dealing with a boyfriend who thought lying was protecting me. Within 2 days of posting it, my inbox was flooded with messages from people who'd gone through similar things. Some had partners who'd hidden important information, others had found evidence of people living in their homes, and a bunch had dealt with landlords who ignored safety concerns. One woman said her ex had done the exact same thing as Parker, researching her apartment obsessively and trying to force her to move without explaining why. Maxwell called me a week later with news that the city had hired him as a special inspector, just for checking old houses. He'd be going through the neighborhoods with original homes from before 1940, looking for modifications that created void spaces. He thanked me for bringing the issue to light because it had completely changed his career path. He was even teaching other inspectors how to spot the signs of hidden spaces and unauthorized modifications. Parker's therapy sessions were getting more intense as his therapist dug into why he'd reacted so extremely to finding the void space. During one of our joint sessions, Parker finally talked about when he was 7, and someone broke into their house while his family was sleeping. He'd hidden in his closet for hours, too scared to check if his parents were okay. His therapist explained that finding evidence of someone in my walls had triggered all those old fears, making him desperate to get me away from danger even if it meant lying and controlling everything. Parker was learning to separate his childhood trauma from current situations, but it was slow work that would take months or years to really fix. 4 months after we'd found the person living in our walls, the prosecutor called to say the case was over. The intruder had accepted a plea deal for multiple counts of trespassing and burglary across all the houses they'd found him in. He got 3 years in prison plus probation after that. Knowing he was locked up made everyone feel better, especially Anna, who'd been having nightmares about someone watching her sleep. She'd started seeing a therapist too, working through the violation of having someone in our home without knowing it. The following week, Anna and I decided to throw a party at our new apartment to celebrate finally feeling safe again. We invited everyone who'd helped us through the mess, including Maxwell and Ellen, who'd become friends through everything. Even Parker came for a little while, though he left after an hour because the therapist said he needed to respect our space and not try to insert himself back into my life too quickly. Anna made a joke about checking the walls before the party started, and we all laughed, even though it wasn't really funny. We'd developed this dark humor about the whole thing as a way to cope with how messed up it had been. Ellen brought documentation showing the old house had been completely gutted and renovated after we moved out. The landlord had to fix all the code violations and properly seal the void space before he could rent it again. A young family had moved in last month after being told the whole history, and they'd installed cameras everywhere plus a security system. Ellen said they seemed happy there and hadn't reported any problems. They even sent a thank you note to the city for making sure the house was safe before they moved in. Parker and I were slowly building something new between us, though we weren't living together and probably wouldn't for a long time. We had rules now, like he had to tell me if something worried him within 24 hours, and I had to actually listen instead of brushing off his concerns. He couldn't research my life or make decisions for me, and I couldn't ignore red flags just because I wanted things to work out. We went on actual dates where we talked about normal things, instead of the trauma that had brought us together and almost destroyed us. Siobhan reached out again after seeing my post online, suggesting we file a lawsuit against the property management company that had owned multiple buildings where these void spaces were found. She'd kept records of every complaint she'd made 5 years ago that got ignored, and she'd found 3 other former tenants with similar documentation. Ellen agreed to provide official city records showing the company had been notified about structural concerns, but never properly investigated them. We met with a lawyer who said we had a strong case for negligence, since the company had ignored multiple reports that could have prevented people from living in the walls of their properties. 6 months after filing the lawsuit, I was unpacking boxes in my new place when I realized I hadn't checked the locks in over a week. The apartment Anna and I shared now had normal walls with no hidden spaces, and Maxwell had personally inspected every inch before we signed the lease. I'd started running again in the mornings, something I couldn't do when I was constantly worried about getting back to check on things. My therapist said the nightmares were normal and would fade with time, but at least now I could sleep through most nights without waking up to check closets and corners. Parker finished his therapy program last month, and the documentary crew contacted him about using his research for their investigation into frogging cases across the country. He gave them everything he'd collected over the years, all those files and notes about houses with weird measurements and missing footage patterns. The producer said his work had helped them identify 12 other cases they wouldn't have found otherwise. Anna burst through the door holding her phone up, practically bouncing as she showed me the ring her girlfriend had given her that morning. She asked me to be her maid of honor, and joked that getting stalked by someone living in our walls was the worst way to become best friends. But at least we got there. We spent the afternoon looking at bridesmaid dresses online while she told me about the proposal at their favorite coffee shop. The lawyer called with news about the settlement, and the number made me sit down hard on the couch. After legal fees, I'd have enough to pay off my student loans completely and still have money left over to actually start saving for the first time in my life. The check arrived 2 weeks later, and I deposited it immediately, watching my loan balance drop to 0 on the banking app. Parker and I had been talking about moving in together again, but this time we looked at places together with Maxwell coming along to check for any structural issues. We walked through 7 different apartments over 2 weekends, with Parker asking questions about security and Maxwell measuring walls to make sure everything matched the floor plans. We found a place on the 3rd floor of a newer building with keycard entry and cameras in all the common areas. The property manager thought we were paranoid when we asked to see the original blueprints, but we signed the lease anyway after Maxwell gave his approval. The old neighborhood had changed too, with the community watch program they started after our case requiring special training about signs of unauthorized occupancy. They held monthly meetings now where residents learned to spot things like unusual wear patterns on locks, unexplained utility usage, and food going missing. The woman who bought our old house after all the renovations sent me a message through the neighborhood group, saying they loved living there and felt completely safe with all the improvements. I got my acceptance letter to the urban planning program, while Parker and I were assembling furniture in our new place. Ellen had written me a recommendation letter talking about how our case had shown the importance of proper building inspections and code enforcement. The program director mentioned during my interview that they wanted more students who understood the real-world impact of housing regulations. Classes would start in the fall, and I'd be able to keep working part-time while studying. Parker had been carrying the ring around for 3 weeks before he finally asked me again, this time over dinner at our apartment with no conditions or demands attached. He said he understood if I needed more time after everything we'd been through, but he wanted to build something real together without any secrets between us. I said yes immediately because we'd already survived the worst thing I could imagine and came out stronger. We're planning a small wedding for next spring with Anna as my maid of honor, and Maxwell doing what he called a security consultation for the venue, which made us laugh, but also made us feel safer. The guest list includes Ellen and everyone else who helped us through that mess, though we're skipping Parker's mom after the lies he told her about black mold. Sometimes I drive past the old house just to see it looking normal with kids' bikes in the front yard and flowers in the window boxes. The void is sealed now, properly this time, and the new family has no idea that someone once lived behind their living room wall for months or maybe years. Parker doesn't come with me on these drives, but he doesn't try to stop me either, which feels like progress. We're getting married in 4 months, and I actually feel ready for it. Not because everything is perfect. but because we learned how to tell each other the truth even when it sounds completely insane. That's the whole story wrapped up. If even one piece of it gave you something to think about, then it was worth sharing. Subscribe and you'll always have the next tip waiting.